Okay, my name is Lawrence McGlynn, and you are listening to the award-winning Philadelphia Hall Monitor here on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHM WPPM. Tonight on the program, we'll be joined by Jennifer Lee, Associate Professor of Law and the Director of the Social Justice Lawyering Clinic at Temple University. Lance Haver will explain how the Trump administration's destruction of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau will affect Philadelphians. And Vanessa Maria Graber will report on the proposed cuts to public media. Denise, how are you tonight?
I'm good. How are you?
We sat through the Home Initiative budget hearing this morning.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure we learned a whole lot more about what's going on there. And then the appropriations bill was delayed again.
Yes, if you blinked during the Appropriations Committee meeting, you missed it.
Yes, it was open. We're adjourning.
Yes, it was grand opening, grand closing.
So we'll have more on that maybe next week. If we get to
that,
it could be a dozen more adjournments before we get there, but we'll see. Mm-hmm. So what we'd like to start off with is our interview with Professor Jennifer Lee, talking about due process and what this really means, and why this is so important right now is because we're seeing people denied their due process rights for what I would say are spurious reasons. And I think that this bears examining so we know exactly what we're talking about when we talk about due process and what that means to us as citizens. So here's our interview with Jennifer Lee. All right, Professor Jennifer Lee, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get into talking about due process and what that means, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I've been teaching at Temple Law School for a decade now. And in particular, I run a clinic called the Social Justice Lawyering Clinic, and we work on different issues, a lot of them impacting low-wage workers and immigrants. And so we do some direct case representation as well as work with grassroots community groups to help support campaigns that they might have related to those issues. And prior to that, I worked for about 15 years as an attorney doing various things, but mostly as an attorney doing farm worker law, so representing farm workers in labor and employment cases and sometimes immigration cases. And then before that, representing housing, doing housing work, representing low-income tenants in New York City.
And one of the things I was really impressed with and very interested in is the work you did in Colorado and North Carolina. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it mostly involved working with workers who worked in agriculture. And one thing that people don't know a lot about is there's a program called the H-2A program. And it's actually a temporary visa program that allows people to come temporarily to the United States to work in agriculture. Sounds great, right? On its surface, it's a great way to come legally, to have a visa. But there are so many abuses within the program that make it really problematic. One example of one of the problems that come up with the visa is that the visa is tied to the employer. So if you work for an employer where the conditions are abusive, you don't really have any choice but to either just continue on with those conditions or going back to your home country. And so what we find is that in a lot of these situations, there can be quite a bit of exploitation. And during my time representing a bunch of these clients, we actually had forced labor or trafficking cases where employers actually held passports and held pay and things like that because they have so much control over these workers based on controlling their visa. So just, some of the work that I did in the past.
How common is that?
How common is the kind of forced labor cases out of the program? I mean, it's not uncommon. So there are a number of cases. You can find reported cases, and there's the H-2A visa, but there's also something called the H-2B, which is kind of the same, but it's in non-agriculture. And so you can find reported cases of forced labor involving many different groups. So when I was in Colorado, for example, we worked on a case called Global Horizons that was nationwide, and it involved bringing workers over from Thailand and putting them on farms, and there were a bunch of forced labor situations. We also worked on a lot of forced labor cases related to the sheep herding industry in Colorado and Wyoming. So it's, it's not every single case. I mean, there are certainly agricultural employers that bring over workers on those visas. Their workers are incredibly happy. They go back to their home country. It all works really well. But there's enough abuse in the program for, lots of advocates to say this is really a problematic structure that we think is engendering the ability of abusive employers to use it for forced labor conditions.
So one of the things that we really want to talk to you about, and we're very glad that we can, is the idea of due process. This has been all over the news lately. Can you tell us what exactly that means?
Yeah, so I think what's been in the news, because due process is actually incredibly large legally, but I'll maybe talk about the most important aspect that we've been seeing in the news recently, which is, so there's a due process clause in the Constitution, both in the 14th and the Fifth Amendment. And essentially what it means, or the way that the Supreme Court has interpreted it, is that before you deprive somebody of life, liberty, or property, you need to have given them due process of law. And so that, in a very famous case, Matthews v. Eldridge, has been interpreted as you have the right to see an impartial adjudicator that's going to determine whether or not the thing can happen to you. So there are examples of, for example, the government seizing your land. Before the government can come and decide we're going to take a bunch of land from you, right? You are entitled to some sort of hearing to have that land taken away from you. So certain rights can be thought of as property too. So it doesn't just have to be physical property. And so what we're seeing is there are instances in which decisions are being made about people to deprive them of life, liberty, or property, and the government's not giving them due process.
So one of the key questions, and I think I've answered this for myself, but I'm not an expert. I don't know. To whom does due process apply? Is it just citizens, or is it anybody who's in the country?
Yeah, so when you get to the immigration context, it's a little bit complicated. And that's because the court has kind of carved around it in certain respects. So you definitely have different due process rights if you're outside the country seeking entry into the country versus if you're inside the country. It also might differentiate with people with different status. But as just kind of a bottom line way to talk about this, except for a specific category of immigrants, which I can talk about in a sec, for the most part, you are required, whether the person is undocumented or not, to put them through process. So the example that people have been seeing in the news of the Venezuelans that were deported under the Alien Enemy Act to El Salvador, that is an example where absolutely advocates are making arguments that labeling and deportation happened without any due process of law. And many would argue that under the case law we have in the United States, that those people are entitled to a hearing, right? A hearing to prove, I mean, there are lots of questions in that case. I mean, one question is whether the Alien Enemy Act could even apply, right, in that situation. But even setting that aside, let's assume that it could, right? There are questions about, do you meet the standards, right, in the act for deportation to be possible? And so you should have a right to defend yourself and say, well, actually, I'm not a gang member, right? You've profiled me because I have these tattoos, which is what I think we're starting to learn about. And that's not sufficient because I have a bunch of evidence showing you that I've never been involved in a gang. You should have a right to present that evidence to an impartial adjudicator. So there is a carve-out category of some people that aren't entitled to due process. But that's kind of a different scenario. Those are people who already have deportation orders in place. So if you're somebody, for example, who has already gotten due process and been ordered deported, but yet have remained in the United States, or perhaps have been deported and come back in, there is a statutory provision that allows the government to just reinstate that order, and you're not entitled to due process. So that's the kind of exceptional category, if that makes sense.
Sure. And we're looking at the Trump administration and the Trump Justice Department. Well, let me ask you this. In your opinion, how are they viewing due process in terms of the immigration cases? And is that like a concern?
Yeah, I don't know that I can stand in their shoes and
Sure.
talk about how they view it, but I think what we're seeing, at least from, observing what it is that they're doing, I think it's quite clear that they're not necessarily providing people with due process, right? And so one could maybe implicate from there that they don't. I don't know if it's that they don't believe that people have due process. I don't know if they're just making these decisions without kind of thinking about what process attaches. I mean, the other scenario where we're seeing this come up, although it's a super complicated issue, is in the student visa realm, right? So folks have heard about student visas being revoked and terminated, and it's all very confusing. And so that, as folks know, there are a bunch of lawsuits that have been filed about, well, before you can just terminate my status, I also should have a right as a student to contest the basis of the termination. If you're saying, well, you were arrested for something, right? Can't I go to an impartial adjudicator and say, well, I was arrested, but the charges were actually dropped because they were mistaken charges, or I was never actually convicted? And so again, we're seeing those sorts of things happening, and they're not being a process for people to access prior to just termination happening. So I think that, at least, I guess what I could conclude is, yes, I think that there are concerns about what's happening with immigrants and whether or not the government is providing them with process before they make a determination that someone should leave the United States or be deported.
Are there things that people, particularly undocumented people, can do to protect themselves?
Yeah, so there are a number of things. I mean, I think the two most important things that have been coming up is there are a number of groups that have been engaged in Know Your Rights trainings for community members. And there are lots of immigrant groups that have been participating in this. Just to name a few, organizations like Juntos in South Philadelphia, an organization like Viet Lead that focuses on the Southeast Asian community, lots and lots of different groups engaging in that work. And I think the most important thing to kind of understand about those rights is that you have a lot of rights in terms of who you can let into private spaces. So what I mean by this is, if ICE came to your home, as an example, you do not have to let them into your home unless if they have a judicially signed warrant, just like as in a criminal case, right? And folks might be familiar with this because this is the Fourth Amendment right to reasonable search and seizure. And the issue is that a lot of times when ICE comes and does arrests, they don't have a judicial warrant. They have something that's called an administrative warrant that's signed internally by somebody at the agency. And so kind of understanding that difference is really important. Sometimes they also have a warrant and it's for a different address. It's not for the person they're looking, right? So just being really careful to tell folks that they do not have to let ICE into these private spaces unless if they have a judicially signed warrant. And that includes home, but it also includes things like private spaces in a workplace, right? So also trying to get information out to employers about, if ICE shows up, what it is that you might have to do and not have to do. The other really important thing that we've been telling folks is the right to remain silent, right? Which is, again, really, it's kind of the right against self-incrimination, just like with the police, right? You don't need to volunteer information about, for example, where you were born, don't need to volunteer documents, and telling people that they have the right to consult with an attorney as well, right? And to tell, if they are being stopped, to say, I don't want to share any information, and I would like my right to talk to an attorney. And so those are some really important rights, and there are actually some really nice Know Your Rights cards that have been produced by various groups that fit into a wallet that people can carry around, that are printed in multiple languages, that can be really useful. The other point that we've been telling folks, and there again have been a lot of sessions on this, is family planning. And so particularly for undocumented immigrants, what we've seen in the past is that when raid arrests have happened, people get picked up in the middle of the day, and they get taken away, and then it's like, what happens to their children, right? Their children come home from school. What are they going to do? Who's going to take care of their children? How are things going to be managed financially? And so there are a number of groups that are also helping people to, secure kind of power of attorney documents, secure plans for, what happens to your children and who's going to take care of them. And so these are some of the things you might just want to get ready. Get all your documents together so that they're easily accessible, so that somebody can find them. So just really trying to prepare people for, the worst case scenario.
All right. I'd like to bring Denise Clay-Murray here on Philadelphia Hall Monitor.
Hi, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yes, of course.
Now, you're talking about due process and how the system is supposed to work. Right now, we have the only presidential administration I have ever seen that has basically told the Supreme Court to kick rocks. And because of that, how do you enforce your due process when you have a group of people that have decided that they don't need to listen to the entire judicial branch?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I think I don't actually know the answer to that. I think it's a kind of wait and see for us. I mean, we obviously know of the you're referring to the Abrego Garcia case, right? Where even though the Supreme Court has said, look, you need to facilitate his return to the United States, it's kind of not happening, or there's at least no parent attempts for that, to make that a reality, and sort of the questions that go with that. I think we have to kind of wait and see where else we're seeing disobedience of orders, because I think people are very worried, but it's too early to tell to say there's been a complete breakdown, right, of the system where, the judiciary is ordering certain things and the administration is absolutely not following any of those things. I think that's a little bit of an overstatement of it right now. And so I think it's a wait and see. And I think it's a really good question, because, when people go down that spiral of, well, what happens when individuals won't comply with a court order? I mean, there really isn't much that a court can do besides hold individuals in contempt. And then, what then happens next? I don't know. I think it's a huge open question that I don't have an answer to.
Okay. Now, in terms of due process, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, when children are brought up into deportation court, there is nothing that says that they have to have legal representation with them. Can you talk a little bit about that, and how if there's anything that citizens can do to make sure that if they see a child getting picked up by ICE, that they have someone who's representing them legally?
Yeah, so this is a really huge problem. So what legally happened, so folks are probably familiar with the fact that you have a right to counsel in criminal proceedings, right, under the Constitution. you do not have a right to counsel in civil proceedings, right? So if I'm being evicted as a tenant by my landlord, I don't have a right to counsel, right, under the Constitution. The problem is that deportation proceedings, despite, it being a proceeding that can be as onerous, right? I mean, if you're deported to a home country where you fear your life, right, might be at stake, the stakes are pretty high, but yet it's been classified as a civil proceeding. And thus, under the Constitution, it doesn't trigger the right to counsel. This is the problem. So with the example about child migrants and the right to counsel, you're 100% right. They don't have the right to counsel, and it's because it's been classified as a civil proceeding. So what can people do about this? I mean, I think, unfortunately, a lot of the solutions at this point are political, right? And they require us really being active and engaging our elected officials to do things. So I'll give two kind of different examples of how this might be something that relates to elected officials. And I think the first is that, cities have done better jobs of raising money to fund kind of more universal representation for immigrants. And we have a funded project here in Pennsylvania that's trying to give people who are detained immigration counsel. And New York City has something similar. So there are potentially ways that local elected officials can put money into providing representation funding that can get attorneys to represent immigrants in immigration proceedings, and that could include children. So that's kind of one way. But the other is that a bunch of money has been cut because Health and Human Services, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, has an Office of Refugee Resettlement, and they have largely been involved in supporting child migrants, particularly unaccompanied migrants, and a lot of that funding has been cut as well. And so I think it's also about talking to federal elected officials about them having to revive these programs. And if anything, child migrants seem to be one space where I think often people across the aisle can agree that we all believe that we need to be protecting pretty vulnerable children. And so again, I think political activism is really going to be the answer to some of that.
Now, as a law professor, looking at the current landscape of due process, do you think that there's going to be like additional education that's required of prospective lawyers going into the profession about that in light of some of the things we've seen coming out, not just coming out of this White House, but just out of the courts in general?
I mean, I think that you're right that people really need to understand that, and I think that law students are kind of having discussions about what does this mean about the rule of law, right? Because I think for a really long time, we've just kind of accepted that there is at least some fundamental premise, right, to the rule of law, and that, like you said, courts issue orders and that people try to comply, particularly government entities try to comply with them, right? But I think that, so I do think that there's some element of having to kind of discuss these issues with law students, but I also feel like historically, it's really important to put all of this into context for students as well, because it often feels like what's happening here is completely unprecedented. And I can't speak about everything that's happening, right? But I can at least speak to the immigration context. And I think it's really important to understand that while some of this feels exceptional, some of it's not that exceptional. I mean, there's been a long history of not welcoming immigrants to the United States, particularly based on race, right? So there were, we have a long history of race-based exclusions, right, until 1965 in our laws. And then we have a really long history that includes even Democratic presidencies, right, under Obama and Biden, of, a pretty continued campaign of trying to deport a lot of immigrants, right? Some who had been longtime residents here. And so it certainly changed in kind of breadth. And, certainly the First Amendment targeting is something that we didn't see under previous administrations. But again, there are historical references for, kind of speech-based or political affiliations being a basis to deport people. So I think it's also really important to kind of put this current moment into context that, it's not like we've always been a society where we've abided by the rule of law, or where, the targeting of vulnerable people who are migrants has never occurred before, right? So I think that's a lot of what we're also trying to teach students, to kind of connect it to the history of, racialized legal exclusion, which is really what the immigration system has been, and that it kind of ebbs and flows, right? We see kind of different, a more aggressive stance, a more kind of less aggressive stance, but still many, many things going on under even Democratic presidencies, and to just understand that perspective, that it's not just a complete alteration of the legal system. That's not entirely what we're seeing right now, although I agree that there are things that are pretty shocking.
And let's be honest here, until the 14th Amendment was passed, I technically wasn't a citizen.
Correct.
And I think sometimes we forget that when we have these discussions, that this goes all the way back to when America was allowed to own people. So thank you so much for giving us some of your time, Professor Lee. And I'm going to give you back to Larry McGlynn, our co-host, and you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5.
All right. Thank you, Denise. Professor Lee, where can people learn more about your work and the social justice lawyering clinic?
So you definitely can go to the Temple website. We're housed at the Scheller Center for Social Justice, which is at Temple Law School. So you can type in Scheller Center and Temple Law, and you'll find our website, and you can find the work that we engage in there. It's not just me. There are other faculty members that are also working on different issues that impact local communities in Philadelphia.
All right, Professor Lee, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we'd like to thank Professor Lee for joining us on the program. And now we'd like to bring on consumer reporter Lance Haver to tell us a little bit about what's going on with the the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. There we go.
Hi, good evening. Yep, it's certainly a mouthful. And I want to put it in historical context, because sometimes people forget why it's there. It's not like the Federal Trade Commission, which is often called the FTC, the initials. The FTC has been around for many, many years. It fights mergers, does a number of things. The CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, was created after the big banks, the finance companies, and the speculators crashed the economy in 2008. Led to a number of mortgage foreclosures, led to literally millions of people losing their jobs, trillions of dollars lost in investments, people facing mortgage foreclosures and housing shortages because the mortgages simply kept resetting, and the house prices continued to fall until so many people were underwater, the mortgage companies failed. And those of us who are old enough to remember, some countries, Ireland, Iceland, Spain, prosecuted the bankers and the investment houses that did this. They sent them to jail. In the United States, we didn't send these companies to jail, we bailed them out. We said, we understand that you're too big to fail. We're not going to hold you accountable in any way. We're simply going to give you a huge amount of money so that you can continue to operate And hopefully now we'll create a bureau, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, that will create rules and regulations so that you don't do it over again, so you don't take advantage of us again. You, the businesses that are now being regulated, should be happy, because if you were in another country, you'd be in jail. And now all that happens is you're regulated and the company that you run has to pay some price. So that's where we are. And Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was originally the child of then law professor Elizabeth Warren, now United States Senator from Massachusetts, and President Obama. And at the time that President Obama put it into effect, he did not hire Ms. Warren. Instead, he decided to go with someone who was much softer on corporate crime than Ms. Warren had been. Now, all that being said, take us to today. The Republican Party and conservatives and business interests have been trying to kill the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau almost since its beginning. And there's a strange way of funding it. It's being funded through the banks, the Federal Reserves, not through an appropriation by Congress. And because of that, the Republican-controlled Congress couldn't just zero it out. What they did is they went to the United States Supreme Court and said, this is not a legal bureau because you're being funded in a different way. And went through the court system, and the United States Supreme Court said, no, it's legal, you can do this, and it exists. So that's what it has been. That's what it was under Presidents Obama and President Biden. It has played a role in trying to regulate these businesses. And what I mean by that is sometimes what they are called nuisance fees. So you're overcharged a couple of dollars, or a bank decides to bounce your check when it really shouldn't have. Or somehow when you want to buy a car, there was an add-on fee. Now, all of these can be $20, $30, $40, and it's really difficult for people to accept it. But at the end of the day, it's not enough money for people to go out and hire a lawyer. Lawyers cost hundreds of dollars an hour. These are not enough money involved for the lawyers to take it on what's often called a contingency basis, meaning the lawyer says, you don't have to give me any money. I'll take 40% of whatever I win you. Well, if a lawyer wins $40, even if they take half of it, that's only $20. That's never going to put enough money in their account for them to keep their lights on, for them to pay their insurance, for them to pay everyone in their law office a living wage. So these organizations, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, is there to protect us against some of these nuisance fees and some of this discrimination. And apparently that is what has been a major complaint with the new administration of President Trump. He has said repeatedly that he wants to do away with it. He has to zero it out. And in fact, he fired 90% of the workers at the Bureau. Now, the courts have said you can't do that, and they've reinstated them. But what we're going to talk about tonight is that that's a Pyrrhic victory, because even if it has 100% staffed, if the people working there aren't allowed to protect us, it doesn't really matter whether they're there or they're not there. In fact, being there and told they can't do anything may be worse than telling people the honest truth, which is that the organization that was set up to protect us against the big banks preying upon us, against the too big to fail institutions, is not there anymore. So I just want to make that clear. Now, unlike other web pages that the Trump administration have changed, doing away with the Tuskegee Airmen, doing away with Jackie Robinson, doing away with the names of the old forts that were removed because they were named after Confederacy heroes, and the Trump administration has decided to go back on that. The Trump administration has taken control of the CFPB. Their secretary is in charge, and all of these things come from their webpage. So it's not something that the news media says. It's not something that I'm saying. These come directly from the webpage. So let's see what the Trump administration is saying the CFPB has been doing, and then ask the question, does anyone really think this is what the Trump voters want us to do away with? So if we could pull up the slide, that would be great. And what we'll do is look at it. So here's again, this, I want to be as clear as I can. This doesn't come from me, doesn't come from the news media, quote unquote, the lamestream media or anybody else. This is right on their webpage. So $17.5 billion is the amount of money the CFPB has put back in Americans' pockets. $4 billion, the amount of money that they have opposed in civil penalties against the companies that stole. 200 million, the number of consumer accounts eligible to receive financial relief. 175 million, the amount of monetary results from 39 public enforcement actions that involved harm to service members and veterans. And I want to pause on this because I know Denise grew up in a military family. I don't know how many people know that our military is not well paid. And often they struggle economically. And so what has happened over the years is a number of what are called payday lenders, where title lenders have set up outside of military bases. And these are preyed upon, these are industries that prey upon the people who are struggling. Payday loans, even though they say the loan is only 30% interest, by the time you add up all the fees and everything else, it becomes 1,000% interest, excuse me. And the way that happens is a payday loan, unlike other loans, you borrow your next paycheck and then you have to pay it all back the next week. And the truth is, almost nobody can do it. So then you have to end up borrowing again and again and again and again. And eventually, the amount of interest you pay is astronomical. Same thing's true with a title loan. A title loan is when you take your car and instead of selling your car, you take the title and you put it up as collateral for a loan. So these happen all over, not in Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania has a law that says you can't charge more than a certain interest rate. But most of the rest of the country doesn't have such a law. And the place where you see many of these payday loans and title loan companies are right outside of military bases, where our service members who are risking their lives for us, who are doing service for us, who we all like to make a big deal out of saying thank you for your service, are preyed upon by these companies. So the CFPB has been going after these companies to shut it down. I don't know, Denise, if you want to talk about growing up seeing these companies, or that's maybe...
Well, here's the I thought that the payday loan people were specifically prohibited from doing payday loans with the military for just this reason. Was that changed?
It's not been changed, but now that's not going to be prosecuted. So like you were asking before, what good are these rights if there's no one to enforce them? You're absolutely right. The laws have been changed to protect the military service people. And that's as a result of the CFPB and the service itself. And to be honest, the religious community, it's a very unusual coalition where you had the military and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the, in often cases, it was the religious community getting together to oppose these high interest loans. And they had been outlawed and they had been stopped. But if you do away with the CFPB and these loans prop up again and they take a slightly different form, who's going to prosecute them? So you see that that's just one of the people who is being protected. 50 million, the number of users who have accessed answers to hundreds of common questions. 4 million, the number of consumer complaints that the CFPB has put out, and 3,000, the average number of complaints by the CFPB. Now, I don't know why someone believes that this is the type of organization that the Trump voters voted against. I'm not sure what's in here that's bad. I'm not sure what's in here is wrong. But again, this is not numbers I came up with. This is not me spending hours and hours and hours of time looking through hundreds of pages of documentation. We're gonna get to some of the research a little later. This is right on their webpage. This comes right from the Trump administration's webpage bragging about how well this institution has done. Now, the question becomes, what are they doing? What are they doing that's helping get this money back? So they took action against the Bank of America for double dipping on non-sufficient fund fees and opening unauthorized consumer accounts. So let me explain that a little bit as well. If you're in the unfortunate position of struggling week to week and you get paid electronically, you may be writing checks based on when you believe your electronic paycheck will be in your account and you'll have access to it. And you may get it wrong because the bank may decide that before they're going to credit your account with your paycheck, they're going to debit your account with the checks that were written at the same time. And they may decide to do that so that they can go ahead and charge you a bounced check fee. Or you may have 3 checks. 2 of the 3 you can cover. The 3rd check is much larger and you can't cover that. So what a bank can do, if they are working for you, is they can cover the first 2 checks and then only charge you 1 bounce fee for the check that can't be covered. And by covered, I mean you don't have enough money in your account for the people putting the check in to get the money out. But what banks were doing, and what the CFPB took action against Bank of America for doing, is they would look for the largest check that was coming in, and they would try and pay that first. And then if they couldn't pay that, then all the smaller checks that could have been paid were also bounced. So instead of getting 1 bounce fee, they get 3 bounce fees. And in addition, they would go ahead and make up accounts because the bankers themselves, people working in the offices, would get credit for opening up new charge accounts. And so they just look through their files and they'd open up charge accounts and other accounts for people who never authorized it. So CFPB went after them, forced them to give $100 million back. Now, in this case, the $100 million went back into the hands of the consumers, not into some other place. People actually got their money back. They got help for people who got their cars illegally repossessed. And again, this is one of those things where you kind of look at it and you go, I don't believe people do this. Many of us who finance cars set up an automatic payment. And that automatic payment comes month after month after month. Car loans now can be as long as 6, 7 years. It's rare that the last payment is the same amount as the previous payments. So to make it easy for me, I'm going to say you have 72 payments, 71 of them are $400. The 72nd payment, the last payment, the one that settles everything, is $725, $25 more. And your payment is paid automatically. You set it up. Almost nobody knows to look at the last payment and ask the question, is it the same as the first 71? So then they go ahead and you get to the 72nd payment and it's not enough. So Wells Fargo was actually repossessing cars. That's what they were doing. They had set it up knowing that they were going to have this advantage because when they repossess a car, there are plenty of fees for them to collect. This was stopped. Credit reporting agencies. Again, this is critically important, not just for when you get a loan or a credit card, but we've talked about here at Hall Monitor. Your homeowner's insurance and your car insurance rates are decided in part, not completely, but in part based on your credit report. And we also know that credit reports can be incorrect. The more common your name is, the more likely it is that your credit report is wrong. If your name is John Brown or Stanley White, there's a good chance that there's somebody else out there with the same name. And many of us move around. Some of us stay in the same house for 30, 40 years, but many of us, especially those of us who are struggling, move. And so now it becomes very difficult to tell one John Smith apart from another John Smith. And so there are mistakes. And there's supposed to be a procedure from the credit reporting agencies to correct those mistakes. You look at your credit report, which is what everyone tells you to do. You say, hey, this isn't my debt. I'm going to contact the credit reporting agency, and they're going to do an investigation, and they're going to correct it. Well, CFPB found that these credit reporting agencies didn't do an investigation. In fact, they failed to look at relevant information and often didn't even tell the people who are looking at your credit report that you had disputed something. So Consumer Financial Protection Bureau went after them, got a refund, and put an end to that practice. Now, this one is, I'm sorry, this is not a good slide, but this is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau attempt to look at how people of color are discriminated against economically with mortgages. And it is true that there is, to the best of my knowledge, there is no mortgage company that says we don't offer loans to African Americans or Latinos. If they did that, of course, they would be prosecuted, they would be hated, people would be really angry at them. So they find other ways to discriminate. And I want to come back to this because this is one of the things that under Trump will no longer happen. So the CFPB asked a very simple question of this mortgage company. They said, how many people do you have in African American or Latino neighborhoods trying to offer these mortgages? And how many people do you have in white neighborhoods? Because that's really the way that most of the discrimination works right now. It's not that there's a sign that says if you're an African American, you can't take out a loan. It's that this company was not seeking African Americans to take out loans. And the CFPB went and said, you can't do that. If you're trying to solicit people for loans, you have to do it without being race-based. You can't purposely hire someone to seek clients in the white neighborhood and purposely have no one in the African American community. And again, a very successful campaign by the CFPB. They made the mortgage company pay a fee, and people who had been denied got money back. The final example I want to give, again, is something that many people are now using. They're the cash apps, whether it's whatever name you want to use it for. The problem here is there's a lot of fraud. Criminals can be exceedingly creative. Yeah, there are criminals who will push you down and take your bicycle or grab your bag and run away. But more and more, the criminals are cyber criminals, and they figure out ways of taking advantage through all of the internet financial contracts and financial transactions that we have. So CFPB took a look at what protections are these cash apps, these ways of transferring money electronically, what do they put into place to protect consumers? And they found that Block, which owns Cash App, didn't do anything. They just looked the other way as people stole the consumers' money. They employed weak security protocols and put users at risk. And while they were legally required to investigate and resolve disputes about unauthorized transactions, the company's investigations were woefully incomplete. And so they were forced again to give money back to the consumers. And these are examples of what the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau had been doing. And again, none of this is secret. This is all well known. Most of it is still on the webpage that the Trump people are going after. So what's happening now? Well, Trump, as I said, tried to fire 90% of the staff to get rid of the agency. Court said you can't do that. But again, I know there are lots of people who think President Trump is a stupid person. I'm not one of those people. I think that, he has been very successful at what he's done. I'm not saying what he's done is good for us. I'm not saying it's helpful. I'm just going to point out that he's managed to create all of these crises so that we don't know what's going on in so many other parts, and this is one part. So he fires 100% of the 90% of the staff. People go to court, they get a court order, and they think that they've won because the court says you have to let those people go back to work. I'm sorry, one more example I wanted to give because this is in the news again. The CFPB took action against the student loan companies that were preying upon students by overcharging them when they were keeping up with their debt payments. And so just one more example. And the reason, again, why I should have mentioned that earlier is because just this week, the Trump administration has announced that they're now going to be turning all of the people who are struggling with student debt, if you get behind, they're going to be turned over to collection agents. So we see that even though all of the workers have been reinstated, the Trump administration's placed a stop work order at the agency. So the CFPB investigators have been unable to press forward on probes into companies whose products and services are used by tens of millions of Americans, including Carvana, the online used car retailer, Mr. Cooper, one of the country's largest mortgage servicers, and Care Credit, which unbelievably is a leader in medical credit cards, a specific credit card for people who don't have adequate health insurance and therefore cannot get service at a hospital or a doctor's office until they sign up for a credit card, which then has predatory interest fees on it. So all the investigations that were going on, the Trump administration has issued a stop work order on, cannot proceed. And what are they actually doing instead? And that is they're ending all the discrimination. And that's what consumers face, and that is what's scary. All of the other things that are going on are horrible. Many of them, however, may be reversed, but these, because very few people are paying attention to them, are not going to be reversed. And with that, we'll talk in the next couple of weeks about what's happening, and we'll see the result. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Lance. And now we'd like to bring on Vanessa Maria Graber to talk a little bit about what's happening with public media.
Hey guys, how are you?
All right.
Hanging in there day by day. There's another executive order, another proposed policy, another budget cut. And so we have had more official news around the threats to public media in the last week or so. So in case you haven't heard, according to Politico and the New York Times, the White House will send Congress a request to claw back nearly $1 billion in already approved federal funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Now, this is the entity that provides federal support for NPR and PBS affiliates across the country. So here locally in Philadelphia, it would be WHYY receiving support from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, as well as many other community radio stations and community TV stations. And so these proposed cuts came from an earlier pledge from DOJ committee leader, House Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. And so I want to play a clip here from that hearing so you can hear their justification for why they want to defund the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which, by the way, has already been approved for federal funding for the next 2 years to the tune of $535 million. And so they're looking to do what's called a rescission, which means they want to scale back that amount significantly. And so let me see if I can add this clip. And this is from C-SPAN. So again, if you ever want to catch federal congressional hearings, you can go onto C-SPAN where it airs. And this actually happened several weeks ago. But at the end of this hearing, which you're hearing now, which will be the closing statement from Marjorie Taylor Greene, she is explaining why DOJ is going to, maybe call for defunding the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
The United States is $36 trillion in debt. In fiscal year 2024, the government spent over $1.8 trillion more than it took in. And in fiscal year 2025, the interest on our debt is expected to exceed $1 trillion. As we continue investigating waste, fraud, and abuse, and we can look no further than the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. The LGBTQ indoctrination of our children, the systematic racism narrative, and the support for censorship being pushed by the heads of NPR, and PBS are just several of the many abuses of taxpayer dollars. And if you are one of the select few who might support such content, you can personally support and fund it with your own money through private donations, because the reality is the United States of America is broke and can't afford it. And after all, PBS and NPR are already fundraising off of this committee hearing. The American people are closely following along today in this long-awaited hearing to hear the case for why Americans' hard-earned tax dollars should continue for public broadcasting. I think from what we have heard here today, the American people will not continue to allow such propaganda to be funded through the federal government with their hard-earned tax dollars. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting that we give over $500 million to no longer serves the public. It serves a narrow audience of wealthy, liberal elites who are out of touch with everyday Americans. Not only have the times changed and the American people who once needed these outlets can now access the news anywhere at any time, but the content that is being put out through these state-sponsored outlets is so radical, it is brainwashing the American people and, more significantly, American children with un-American, anti-family, pro-crime fake news.
Okay, so we'll leave it there. You get the point. This is the justification for wanting to cut funding that's already been approved through a federal budgeting process. As you know, that's all done through legislation. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting is already funded for 2 years. So technically, that legislation passed last year. And for the next 2 years, they have funding. When you look at the White House's memo that was released shortly after this hearing, addressing the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, most of their justification is based on anti-LGBT rhetoric that they're using. They cite a number of examples of when PBS or NPR just featured the voices of, trans people or people from the LGBT community. They cited a documentary that was about somebody going through a transition, as propaganda and brainwashing. And so I say that because these things are motivated in hate, right, and in fear. And
I don't mean to cut you off, Vanessa, but I just got to say this. I have a 4-year-old. I want him to know there are other types of people out there who have different viewpoints and different religious beliefs and whatever. That, and you know what happens if you don't do that? You grow up to be Marjorie Taylor Greene. Anyway,
Well,
sorry.
Well,
yeah, if you could just let me quickly go through some of the numbers, because we only have a few minutes left. But again, to remind people about the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, it goes to more than 1,500 locally owned public radio and television stations. And so about 386 radio grantees, 158 television grantees, and about almost half are considered rural stations. And so this would disproportionately impact communities that don't have as much access to the media as places like Philadelphia. So say for some reason WHYY to lose funding or even shut down completely, we would have many other sources of news. But there are more than 200 counties across the country and more than 55 million people who have no local news source or little access to local news. And just two more things, as you mentioned, CPB was developed in 1967 primarily for the purpose of funding children's educational television programming. So we're talking about Sesame Street and many other programs. And then secondly, a big portion of the money goes to emergency broadcast services. And so I know that they are justifying it based on this other thing, but the reality is that these cuts will be really significant. So folks want to learn more, they can go to protectmypublicmedia.org. That's a campaign being put on. You can learn more information, and we'll have to leave it there, but keep you posted as these threats continue to develop.
All right, we'll see you next week on Hall Monitor.